September 1982, Shenandoah County. The air held the first crisp promise of autumn, a coolness that settled in the hollows before dawn and lingered until the sun cleared the Massanutten Ridge. For the apple growers of the valley, it was a time of reckoning, the culmination of a year's labor measured in the weight and color of the fruit hanging from their trees. For most, the reckoning was grim. Arthur Pearsall stood at the edge of his 10-acre orchard, his back to the rising sun. He was 71 years old, a man shaped by the land he stood upon. His hands were thick, the knuckles swollen with arthritis, but they were steady. His face was a roadmap of seasons, creased and weathered by sun and wind. He wore a faded denim shirt and canvas trousers held up by suspenders, the same attire he had worn for 50 years of work. He looked at his trees. They were mostly Stamen and York Imperial, old varieties his father had planted in the 1930s. The limbs, thick and gnarled like an old man's arms, drooped low, heavy with fruit. They were so laden that Arthur had spent the better part of August propping them up with 2x4 posts, lest they break under their own abundance. The apples were a deep, uniform red, catching the morning light with a waxy sheen. The sight was not one of triumph, but of simple, quiet correctness. It was as it should be. This was not the case for his neighbors. For the third year in a row, the county's apple crop was failing. The problem had started subtly, a slight drop in yield that was blamed on a late frost. The next year, it was worse, and the experts from the Virginia Tech Extension Office had pointed to a new strain of powdery mildew. This year, it was a catastrophe. The trees had blossomed beautifully in May, a sea of white and pink that filled the valley with false hope. But the fruit set had been abysmal. Most of the blossoms had simply withered and fallen, leaving behind barren spurs. The apples that did form were small, often misshapen. What the old-timers called monkey-faced fruit, the talk of the Shenandoah Farmers Cooperative was of blind wood, of nutrient deficiencies, of a changing climate. It was a crisis that threatened not just a single harvest, but the livelihood of a community that had defined itself by its orchards for over a century. Men who had inherited their farms from their grandfathers were now talking of selling to developers from Fairfax County. They had tried everything the modern world had to offer. They had sprayed fungicides on a precise schedule. They had applied tons of potash and lime, following the detailed soil reports from the university. They had pruned aggressively, using the new open center techniques touted in the trade magazines. Each effort was a costly failure, another layer of debt settled upon land that was no longer paying its way. They had done everything right according to the new rules, and everything had gone wrong. Arthur had done none of these things. He had watched the flurry of activity on the surrounding farms with a quiet, impassive gaze. He had listened to the theories at the co-op, nodding but never offering an opinion of his own. His methods were seen as archaic, his refusal to modernize a sign of stubbornness bordering on senility. His orchard was a relic, an island of the past in a sea of progressive agriculture. The central figure in this wave of progress was a young man named Richard Davies. He was the new county extension agent, fresh out of graduate school with a master's degree in horticulture. He was sharp, energetic, and filled with the unshakable confidence of a man who believes in data. He drove a county-issued Ford Fairmont and carried a stainless steel clipboard on which the fate of the valley's orchards was charted in neat columns and graphs. Davies had arrived in the spring, just as the panic was beginning to set in. He held a town hall meeting in the high school gymnasium. He stood before a crowd of anxious, weathered farmers and spoke of soil pH, of integrated pest management, of foliar nutrient sprays. He presented slides with charts showing declining magnesium levels in leaf tissue samples from a dozen local orchards. "The problem, gentlemen," he had announced, his voice echoing slightly in the cavernous room, "is a complex cascade of nutrient lockout exacerbated by a persistent fungal load. Our strategy must be multi-pronged and data-driven." He had dismissed the older theories with a patient, almost pitying smile. A late frost? The temperature logs don't support it as a primary cause, a new pest. Our insect traps show nothing outside the normal parameters. He spoke a language of science and certainty that left little room for the generational knowledge that had once governed these farms. The farmers, desperate for a solution, had listened. They had bought the expensive new fertilizers, the targeted fungicides. They had trusted the data. A week after the meeting, Davies had visited Arthur's farm as part of his county-wide survey. He had walked the rows of trees, his polished shoes a stark contrast to the clover-rich sod beneath them. He made notes on his clipboard, his brow furrowed with professional concern. "Mr. Pearsall," he had said, his tone carefully diplomatic, "your ground cover management is unconventional. This much clover can harbor pests and compete with the trees for nitrogen." Arthur had looked at the thick carpet of white clover, then at his trees. "The clover is for them," he said, gesturing with his chin toward a row of white wooden boxes at the far end of the orchard. Davies had squinted, his eyes following Arthur's gesture. He saw the beehives, 50 of them, arranged in 2 neat rows along the edge of the woods. A low, steady hum filled the air around them. "You're a beekeeper?" Davies asked, a note of surprise in his voice. "My father was," Arthur replied. "I just keep his boxes." Davies had clicked his pen. "Well, that's a fine hobby. But with all due respect, it's not going to address your fruit set problem. Wind and native pollinators are generally sufficient for an orchard this size. The real issue is in your soil chemistry and disease management. I can draw up a spray and fertilization schedule for you. We can get these old trees back to producing at their maximum potential." Arthur had simply nodded. He did not argue. He did not try to explain. He had learned long ago that some things could not be taught with words. They had to be seen. He thanked Mr. Davies for his time and watched the Ford Fairmont drive away, kicking up a small cloud of dust on the gravel lane. The community's reaction to Arthur's bees was a mixture of amusement and pity. At the co-op, where the farmers gathered for coffee on Saturday mornings, his project was a source of gentle mockery. "Heard Arthur's given up on apples," one farmer, a man named Bill Henderson, had said over the rim of his styrofoam cup. "He's farming bugs now." The comment was met with a few tired chuckles. These men were Arthur's neighbors. They had known him their whole lives. They respected him as a good man, an honest man, but they saw him as a man left behind by the times. "He's got 50 hives down there," another added. 50. Can you imagine the work? And for what? A little honey. It's a shame, Henderson had concluded, shaking his head. That orchard used to be one of the best in the county. His father, Thomas, he knew how to grow an apple. Arthur's just letting it go. They saw the weeds in his orchard floor, the old, unpainted beehives, and the quiet old man tending them, and they saw failure. They saw a man retreating into a pointless hobby while his livelihood withered on the branch. They could not see the deep, invisible architecture of the system he was building. They could not see the knowledge that guided his hands. That knowledge was not his own, not originally. It was a legacy, a trust passed down from his father. As the valley buzzed with the talk of Davies's new methods, Arthur found his thoughts drifting back more and more often to the past, to conversations held a lifetime ago. He remembered a specific afternoon in the late 1940s. He was a young man then, just back from the war, strong and full of the new world's ideas. The first chemical pesticides were becoming widely available, miraculous products that promised to eliminate the codling moth and the apple scab that had plagued orchards for generations. He had stood with his father, Thomas Pearsall, in the same spot where he now stood. He had held a brochure for a new insecticide, its pages filled with bold claims and pictures of perfect, blemish-free apples. "We should try this, Pa," he had said. "It could double our yield of grade A fruit." His father had taken the brochure and studied it for a long moment. Thomas was a man of few words, but his silence was always thoughtful. He was a listener, not just to people, but to the land itself. He had a way of looking at a tree and seeing not just its present condition, but its entire history and future potential. "It kills the moths," it says. Thomas had mused, tapping the paper. "What else does it kill?" "It's designed for pests," Arthur had replied, a little impatiently. "A bee is a pest to a man in a hurry," his father had said, his eyes scanning the orchard. "But she's the life of the tree. You see that blossom?" He pointed to a delicate white flower on a nearby limb. "That's a promise. It's not the apple. It's just the promise of an apple. The bee is the one who turns that promise into a fact. She's the messenger. That was the beginning of Arthur's real education. Over the next decade, his father had taught him to see the orchard not as a collection of trees to be managed, but as a complex, interconnected community. The core principle of his father's philosophy was simple, a truth he returned to again and again. "We don't farm apples, son," he would say, his hands deep in the soil or gentle on a honeycomb frame. "We farm the whole system. The soil, the clover, the worms, the bees, the trees. They all work together. If you take one piece out, the whole thing gets weak." His father had seen the future with a clarity that bordered on prophecy. He had watched as his neighbors cleared the hedgerows and wildflower meadows to plant more trees, as they adopted the new chemical sprays that made the air smell of poison after each application. He had watched as the wild pollinators, the bumblebees, the mason bees, the sweat bees began to disappear. "They're poisoning the messengers," Thomas had said one evening, his voice heavy with a sadness Arthur was too young to fully understand. "They think they're saving the fruit, but they're killing the future. One day, the blossoms will open and no one will come call. The trees will make their promises, and the wind will carry them away, unanswered." The physical manifestation of this knowledge was stored in a shelf in the old farmhouse office. It was a set of 12 leather-bound ledger books, one for each year from 1948 to 1959. They were his father's orchard journals. On the winter nights when the wind howled outside, Arthur would take one down. The pages were filled with his father's neat, methodical script. He had recorded everything. The date of the first bloom for each variety, the daily high and low temperatures, the direction of the wind, and, most importantly, the bees. A typical entry from May 1952 read, May 14th. Yerkes in full bloom, stamen just past peak. Clear skies, wind from the SW light. Bees active from 8 a.m. until dusk. Strong honey flow. Counted 12 bees on a single branch in 1 minute. Fruit set should be heavy this year. Another, from a few years later, held a note of warning. May 10th, 1957. Henderson sprayed his west block today. Parathion, wind from the west. Found a carpet of dead honeybees at the entrance of Hive 4 and Hive 5 this evening. A terrible waste. A terrible silence. These journals were more than just records. They were a conversation across time. They were a testament to a way of seeing the world that had been discarded as inefficient and unscientific. For Arthur, they were a blueprint. He had spent the last 2 years not just reading them, but studying them, cross-referencing bloom times with weather patterns, internalizing the deep, patient wisdom contained in their pages. He was not just keeping bees as a hobby. He was systematically reintroducing the most vital, missing piece of his father's system. His work had begun in earnest the previous winter. He had found his father's old beekeeping equipment in the back of the barn, stored away for 30 years. The smokers were rusted, the hive tools coated in a thick layer of hardened propolis. The wooden hive bodies, made of cypress, were weathered but sound. His father had always said, "Cypress for the bees, boy." At last, he was right. Arthur had spent weeks cleaning and repairing the equipment. He sat by the wood stove in his workshop, the smell of melting beeswax filling the cold air. He scraped the old propolis from the frames, a substance as hard as stone, and recoated the foundations with fresh wax. He meticulously repaired the cypress boxes, replacing a rotted bottom board here, a split side panel there. It was slow, deliberate work, a meditation in wood and wax. He did not use a power sander. He used a hand plane, its blade sharpened to a razor's edge to smooth the wood. He could feel the grain, the history of the tree, through the tool in his hands. He did not use a nail gun. He used a hammer and galvanized nails, driving each one with a steady, practiced rhythm. Each repair box was a small act of devotion, a tribute to the man who had built them decades before. He chose the site for the apiary carefully at the east end of the orchard, where the hives would catch the morning sun but be protected from the harsh north wind by a stand of white pines. He built a sturdy wooden rack to keep the hives off the damp ground, just as his father's journals described. In March, he had driven his 1968 Ford F-100 pickup truck a vehicle he had maintained himself for over a decade, to a small farm in Augusta County. The farm belonged to an old man even more ancient than Arthur, a beekeeper who kept a strain of Italian bees known for their gentle disposition and prolific honey production. These were not mass-produced bees ordered from a catalog in Georgia. They were local stock, adapted to the specific climate and flora of the Shenandoah Valley. Arthur had purchased 50 packages of bees. Each package was a simple wooden box with screen sides, containing 3 pounds of worker bees and a single, caged queen. The drive home was a surreal experience. The cab of his truck was filled with the low, constant hum of 100,000 bees, a sound that was not threatening, but deeply, primally alive. The installation of the bees was a ritual performed on a warm, still afternoon in early April. He wore his father's old bee veil, the cotton soft and thin from years of use, and a pair of leather gloves. He worked without hurry, his movements slow and deliberate. For each hive, the process was the same. He would open the new hive body, which contained 10 empty frames with wax foundations. He would pry the lid off the bee package and gently shake the mass of insects into their new home. The air would fill with a vortex of confused, flying bees. Then, he would locate the small cage containing the queen, remove the core from one end, and plug the hole with a piece of marshmallow. He would suspend the queen cage between 2 frames, and the worker bees, drawn by her pheromones, would slowly eat through the candy to release her over the next few days. This slow release ensured the colony would accept her as their own. He performed this task 50 times, a long and repetitive process that lasted until dusk. His neighbors, driving by on the county road, saw only a strange old man enveloped in a cloud of insects, and they shook their heads. They did not see the careful, patient establishment of 50 new families, 50 engines of pollination being brought online. The next step was to provide for them. An orchard in bloom is a feast for bees, but it is a brief one, lasting only a few weeks. To keep his colonies strong and healthy for the entire season, Arthur needed to provide a continuous source of nectar and pollen. This was the reason for the weeds that so concerned Mr. Davies. In late April, Arthur had walked the rows of his orchard with a hand-crank seed spreader, the kind his father had used. He was not planting grass. He was sowing a mixture of white Dutch clover, Alsike clover, and borage. These were plants the modern orchardist considered competition, weeds to be eradicated with herbicides. To Arthur, they were the second pillar of his system. The clover would fix nitrogen in the soil, reducing the need for artificial fertilizers. Its dense mat of roots would prevent erosion and retain moisture. But most importantly, it would bloom from late May through August, providing a rich source of forage for his bees long after the apple blossoms had fallen. It would keep the hive strong, populous, and ready for the next spring. By mid-May, the orchard was transformed. The apple trees exploded in a riot of blossoms, their perfume thick on the air. And beneath them, the first of the clover began to bloom, creating a carpet of white. The sound was the most remarkable change. The orchards of his neighbors were silent, save for the whisper of the wind. Arthur's orchard was alive with a sound so immense it was almost a physical presence. It was the collective hum of millions of wings, the sound of an army at work. He would spend hours just watching them. He saw his bees, their legs laden with yellow pollen, moving methodically from blossom to blossom. They did not just visit the flowers. They worked them, burrowing deep, their fuzzy bodies brushing against the stigma and anthers, performing the ancient act of pollination with an efficiency that no machine or chemical could ever replicate. He saw them drinking from the clover, then returning to the apple blossoms. He saw them everywhere, on every tree, on every branch, on every flower. The bloom lasted for 3 weeks. It was a period of intense, focused activity. When it ended, and the petals began to fall like snow, a new kind of quiet returned to the orchard. But it was not an empty quiet. It was a quiet of anticipation. The first signs of success appeared in early June. Arthur walked his rows, his eyes scanning the branches not for what was there, but for what was not. In his neighbor's orchards, he had seen the sad side of fruit spurs that were completely bare, where the blossoms had failed to be pollinated. In his own orchard, almost every cluster of blossoms had been replaced by a cluster of tiny, embryonic apples. The fruit set was not just good, it was overwhelming. The trees had converted their promises into facts with an astonishing profligacy. Arthur now faced a problem his neighbors would have killed for. He had too much fruit. If he allowed it all to mature, the apples would be small and the branches would break under the immense weight. So began the painstaking process of thinning. For weeks, he moved from tree to tree, a ladder in one hand and a pair of small shears in the other. He carefully snipped off the smaller apples in each cluster, leaving only the largest and best-formed, the king bloom, to grow. It was a brutal form of triage, a sacrifice of the many for the good of the few. He dropped thousands of tiny, perfect apples to the ground, where they would rot and return their nutrients to the soil. Bill Henderson, his neighbor to the west, had watched him do this one afternoon from the seat of his tractor. He had cut his engine and walked over to the fence line. "Thinning them, Arthur?" he had asked, his voice a mixture of curiosity and disbelief. "I barely have enough on my trees to make a decent pie." "The bees did their work," Arthur had replied simply, not breaking his rhythm. "Now I have to do mine." Henderson had looked at the carpet of tiny green apples on the ground, then at the heavily laden branches above. He looked back at his own sparse trees. He did not say anything else. He just shook his head slowly and walked back to his tractor. It was the first moment that a seed of doubt about Arthur's foolishness might have been planted in the community's mind. Through the summer, Arthur managed his hives. He was not a honey farmer. The honey was just a byproduct, a salary paid by the trees to their most valuable employees. His primary goal was to maintain the health and population of his colonies. Twice a month, he would open each hive for inspection. He would puff a little cool smoke from his father's old smoker into the entrance to calm the bees. The smoke masked their alarm pheromones and made them less defensive. He would then gently pry the lid off the hive and lift out the frames one by one. He looked for the queen, a long, elegant bee at the center of the colony's life. He looked for the brood pattern, a solid, compact area of capped cells that indicated a healthy, productive queen. He looked for signs of disease or pests, like the dreaded varroa mite, a parasite that was just beginning to be a problem in the region. His hands, though clumsy with age, were gentle and sure as he handled the frames, each one heavy with honey, pollen, and developing bees. He moved with a practiced economy, a quiet confidence that the bees seemed to sense. He was rarely stung. He was not an intruder in their world. He was its steward. As the summer wore on, the difference between Arthur's orchard and the surrounding ones became impossible to ignore. His apples swelled, their color deepening from green to a rich, blushing red. The branches of his trees sagged lower and lower, until the fruit almost touched the clover below. The air in his orchard smelled sweet, a mixture of ripe apples and honey. The orchards around him were a study in failure. The trees looked stressed, their leaves a pale green. The few apples they held were small and clung to the upper branches, as if the trees were ashamed of their meager offering. Richard Davies, the extension agent, continued to make his rounds. His data-driven solutions had not worked. The fungicides had not stopped the blossoms from dropping. The fertilizers had not produced more fruit. He was a man confronting the limits of his knowledge, and it made him defensive and frustrated. He drove past Arthur's farm in late August. He had been avoiding it, perhaps unconsciously. The sight of the unconventional orchard, with its weedy floor and its strange old keeper, was an affront to his orderly, scientific worldview. But this time he could not just drive by. He slowed his Fairmont, then pulled over to the side of the road. He got out of the car, leaving the engine running. He did not have his clipboard. He stared at Arthur's trees. It was not just one or two trees that were full. It was every single tree in every single row. The uniformity of the crop was breathtaking. The sheer weight of the fruit was a physical reality that defied all his spreadsheets and soil analyses. He could see the 2x4 props Arthur had placed under the heaviest limbs, a crude but effective solution to the problem of extreme abundance. He looked to his right, at Bill Henderson's orchard across the road. The contrast was stark, almost cruel. Henderson's trees looked barren in comparison. Davies stood there for a long time, the quiet hum of his car's engine mingling with the much deeper, more ancient hum coming from the orchard. He was a man of data, and the data before his eyes was irrefutable. Something had happened here, something that his science had not predicted and could not explain. He got back in his car and drove away, a deep line of contemplation etched on his young face. Harvest season arrived in the second week of September. It was a time of frantic activity for most farmers, a race against time to get the crop in before the first hard frost. For Arthur, it was a period of steady, methodical work. He did not hire a large crew. It was just him and a high school boy from down the road, a quiet kid named Sam who was saving for a car. They used an old but well-maintained apple harvester, a simple machine that carried 4 large wooden bins. Arthur drove his 1952 John Deere Model M tractor, its 2-cylinder engine popping with a gentle, familiar rhythm, pulling the harvester slowly down the rows. Sam stood on the platform, picking the apples from the lower branches and placing them carefully in the bins. Arthur picked from the latter, his movements economical and sure. They did not rush. Each apple was handled with care, its stem intact, placed, not dropped, into the bin. His father had taught him that, too. An apple is a living thing. Even after you pick it, he had said, you treat it with respect. The bins filled up with astonishing speed. Each one held 25 bushels of apples, nearly 1,000 pounds of fruit. They were filling a bin every 15 minutes. By the end of the first day, they had filled 20 bins, a mountain of red fruit that sat waiting for the truck from the packing house. The truck arrived the next morning. The driver, a man who had been hauling apples from this valley for 30 years, stared at the stacked bins with open disbelief. Arthur, he said, shaking his head, I haven't seen a crop like this since your father was running this place. What in God's name did you do? The bees were busy this year, Arthur said. The quantification of his success came a week later at the Shenandoah Valley Fruit Packers Co-op. The manager, a man named Frank Miller, called Arthur into his office. Miller was a practical man, a man who dealt in numbers, pounds, bushels, grades, and prices. He had a printout from the weighing station in his hand. He looked at Arthur over the top of his reading glasses. Arthur, he began, his voice flat with astonishment, we've run the numbers twice because we didn't believe them. Your 10 acres of Stamen and Yorks, you yielded 820 bushels per acre. Arthur nodded. The number was good, but it did not surprise him. Miller continued, his voice rising slightly. The county average this year is going to be under 400. Some folks are lucky if they get 300. You've more than doubled the average. He paused, letting the number hang in the air. And the quality, 92% grade A. The apples are big, uniform, perfect color. We've never seen a percentage that high from old trees like yours. We're getting a premium for them from the chain stores up in D.C. He leaned back in his chair and took off his glasses, rubbing his eyes. Everyone else is going broke, and you're having the best year of your life. I have to ask, what did you do differently? Was it that new fertilizer from the extension agent? No, Frank, Arthur said. I didn't use it. The new fungicide that... Arthur shook his head. Didn't use that either. Miller stared at him, genuinely mystified. Then what was it? I kept bees, Arthur said. The news of Arthur's yield spread through the valley like wildfire. The men at the co-op no longer chuckled about his bug farming. Their mockery was replaced by a grudging, bewildered respect. The numbers were undeniable. 820 bushels per acre. 92% grade A. These were not matters of opinion or theory. They were hard, profitable facts. Arthur Pearsall, the stubborn old man who had been written off as a relic, had somehow succeeded where all of modern agriculture had failed. The community was forced to reevaluate not just Arthur, but the very nature of the problem they had all been facing. A few days later, a Ford Fairmont pulled into Arthur's lane. It was Richard Davies. He did not park by the road this time. He drove all the way up to the barn and shut off the engine. He sat in his car for a full minute before he got out. He was not carrying his clipboard. He walked over to where Arthur was cleaning one of his apple bins with a pressure hose. Arthur saw him coming, but did not stop his work. He simply turned down the pressure on the washer. Davies stopped a few feet away, his hands in his pockets. He looked tired. The supreme confidence he had projected at the town hall meeting was gone, replaced by a deep and unsettling humility. "Mr. Pearsall," he said, his voice quiet. "I was wrong." Arthur turned off the water. The silence that followed was broken only by the chirping of crickets in the afternoon sun. "I saw your numbers at the packing house," Davies continued. "I've spent the last 3 days trying to make them fit my models. They don't. My soil analysis, my disease vectors, my nutrient plans, none of it accounts for what you did here. I came here to ask if you would be willing to tell me why I was wrong." It was a direct, honest admission of failure, a request for knowledge from a man who had, just a few months earlier, believed he had all the answers. Arthur looked at the young man. He saw no arrogance left in him, only a genuine, desperate desire to understand. He gave a slight nod. "The work's done for the day," he said. "Come on inside. I'll put on a pot of coffee." They sat at the old oak table in Arthur's kitchen. The house was simple, clean, and filled with the faint, sweet smell of beeswax. Arthur poured 2 cups of coffee into thick ceramic mugs. For a long moment, they sat in silence. Then Arthur spoke. "You were looking at the soil, Mr. Davies," he said, "and that's important. But you weren't looking at the air." Davies frowned. "The air. My father taught me that the most important work in an orchard happens in the air, between the flower and the bee. You called it pollination, but you treated it like a given, like the rain. Something that just happens. But it doesn't just happen anymore. We made it stop happening." Arthur got up from the table and went into the small office off the kitchen. He came back with one of his father's leather-bound journals. He opened it to a page from 1957 and laid it on the table in front of Davies. "This is my father's journal," he said. Davies leaned forward, looking at the neat, dated entries. He saw the records of bloom times, of weather, and the meticulous notes on bee activity. He saw the entry about the dead bees after the neighbor had sprayed with parathion. "Your father kept records like this?" Davies asked, his voice filled with awe. This is 30 years of ecological data. Why wasn't this ever shared with the Extension Office?" "Because the Extension Office stopped asking the right questions," Arthur said, without any trace of accusation in his voice. It was a simple statement of fact. They started looking at the farm as a factory, a machine you could add inputs to and get outputs from. A tree became a unit of production. You measured the chemistry of the soil and the tissue of the leaves. You forgot to measure the life. He explained his father's philosophy, the idea of the orchard as a complete system. He talked about the disappearance of the wild pollinators, the slow, invisible death that had been happening for decades. The crisis of the last 3 years wasn't a new problem, he explained. It was simply the moment when the system had finally, completely broken down. There were no longer enough messengers to turn the blossoms into fruit. "The bees I brought in," Arthur said, "they didn't just pollinate my trees. Their presence is a sign that the system is healthy enough to support them. The clover I planted, which you call the weed, it feeds the bees when the apples aren't in bloom. It also fixes nitrogen in the soil, so I don't need to buy as much fertilizer. Its roots hold the water, so the trees are less stressed in a dry spell. It all works together." Davies was silent for a long time, his fingers tracing the script in the old journal. He was a scientist, trained to respect data. And here was a lifetime of data, recorded with a loving, patient precision that shamed his own computer printouts. It was a different kind of science, a science of observation and connection rather than just analysis and intervention. "Pollinator collapse," Davies said, the term sounding new and important on his lips. "We've talked about it in academic circles, but it was always theoretical. A future problem. I never thought to look for it here now." "It's not in the future," Arthur said. "It's been in the past for 30 years. We were just living off the fumes of the old system. Now the fumes are gone." That afternoon marked a turning point, not just for Richard Davies, but for the entire county. He did not just learn a lesson, he acted on it. He became a convert, and he used the institutional authority he possessed to spread the gospel of the bee. He started by writing a new report, a complete reversal of his earlier findings. He acknowledged his error publicly, a move that took immense professional courage. He detailed the collapse of native pollinator populations as the primary cause of the crop failures. He used Arthur's yield data as the undeniable proof of concept for the solution. He called it the Pearsall method, a system of integrated pollination management. He organized a new town hall meeting. This time, he was not the sole expert at the podium. Arthur Pearsall sat beside him, quiet and unassuming. Davies presented his new findings, but he deferred to Arthur to explain the practical application. Arthur, a man who rarely spoke more than a few words at a time, stood before his neighbors and spoke for 20 minutes about his father's wisdom, about the clover, and about the bees. He did not use charts or graphs. He just told the story. The farmers, humbled by their own failures and stunned by his success, listened. The following spring, the valley changed. Richard Davies used discretionary funds from the Department of Agriculture to create a pollinator restoration program. He bulk ordered bee packages from reputable breeders and sold them to farmers at cost. He bought tons of clover and borage seed and distributed it for free. White beehives began to appear at the edges of orchards all over the county. The sound of buzzing, once confined to Arthur's 10 acres, began to return to the valley. The men at the co-op now talked not of fungicides, but of hive inspections and queen health. They asked Arthur for advice, which he gave freely but quietly, usually by showing rather than telling. He would help a neighbor install a newbie package or identify a weak brood pattern, his gnarled hands moving with a teacher's gentle confidence. The Pearsall orchard became a symbol, a living library of a forgotten knowledge. The old, handmade cypress hives his father had built stood as monuments to a more patient, observant way of farming. They were not obsolete. They had simply been waiting for people to remember why they were built. The next harvest, and the one after that, were the best the county had seen in a generation. The yields were up across the board. The apple trees of the Shenandoah Valley were making promises again, and this time, there were messengers to carry them. The crisis was over. A new, more resilient stasis had been achieved. Arthur Pearsall's success was no longer remarkable. It was simply the way things were done. One cool afternoon in the third autumn after his great harvest, Arthur was in his workshop, rendering beeswax in a double boiler on the old wood stove. The air was thick with its sweet, floral scent. The young man, Sam, who had helped him with that first harvest, was there. He had graduated high school and was now studying agriculture at the local community college. He spent 2 afternoons a week at Arthur's farm, not for pay, but for the education. He was building a new hive body from a stack of cypress wood. He was using Arthur's hand plane, his movements still a little clumsy, but growing more confident each week. "Mr. Pearsall," Sam said, pausing to check the squareness of his work. "Mr. Davies came and spoke to our class last week. He talked all about the Pearsall method. He showed them slides of your orchard. He called you a pioneer." Arthur grunted, pouring the liquid golden wax into a set of molds. "Your corner joint isn't flush," he said, pointing with a ladle. "You need to take another pass with the plane." Sam looked down at his work, then back at Arthur. He said, "You saved the apple industry in this county." Arthur set the ladle down and picked up a block of hardened beeswax from the workbench. He held it in his palm. It was warm and smelled of 1,000 flowers. "This saved it," he said, holding it out for the boy to see. "The bees make this. They build their whole world out of it. It's their house, their pantry, their nursery. They do the work. All I did was give them a decent place to live and something to eat." He handed the block of wax to Sam. The boy took it, his young hands feeling the weight and texture of it. He was holding the very substance of a system, the physical product of 1,000,000 tiny, purposeful journeys. He was holding the answer. He looked from the wax, to the old man, to the half-finished beehive on his bench. He was beginning to understand that the knowledge was not in a book or a lecture, but in the wood, in the wax, and in the work itself. The torch was being passed, not with words, but with the quiet, shared understanding of a craft. Arthur Pearsall lived for another 5 years. He never expanded his orchard, never bought a new tractor. He continued to tend his 50 hives, to walk his rows of clover, and to watch the seasons turn. His life did not change, but the world around him did. His quiet, stubborn adherence to an old truth had remade the landscape of his community, bringing it back from the brink of collapse into a new and sustainable abundance. He was buried in the small churchyard on the hill overlooking his farm. On the day of his funeral, the orchards of the Shenandoah Valley were in full bloom. The air, from one end of the county to the other, was filled with the scent of apple blossoms and the low, steady hum of millions of bees at work. It was the sound of a promise being kept, the sound of a system in balance. It was the sound of a legacy, not written in stone, but carried on the wind from one flower to the next.